Well, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started, and I think Dan, or you are the first one up, you and Anessa.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and I haven't had a chance to thank you, but it's always an honor and a pleasure to come here and interact with this incredible group of folks that have been working jointly and collaboratively, very successfully in the hardest place on Earth and off Earth to do it. And just to be a part of this is always wonderful. Dr. Kozlovskaya and I headed up the group discussion yesterday to basically look at what we do with respect to cooperative research on board station and to figure out ways that we can get better. And the space station is a commodity that is dwindling, unfortunately. So we're down within probably 10 or so years of no longer having a space station. And we're getting ready, seriously contemplating and doing more than that. We're building hardware to take us to deep space destinations, and the work on space station is critical to inform that, to inform the designs, the kinds of things we do with space station. There's lots and lots of challenges that are part and parcel of an exploration type mission that even space station has a hard time being an analog for. The autonomous requirements for crew, for how they operate the exploration class missions is something that space station isn't particularly well suited for, but we do still have an opportunity to capitalize on some of that work, but it's going to require us to be more collaborative, to be more innovative in our thinking of how to do more with space station with the limited amount of time we have. So some of the things, what we did first, and we've talked about this, I know, in previous years as well, is to try to get our arms around what the benefits of cooperative research are, just to remind ourselves how and why it's important. We talk about some of the challenges that are faced, when it comes to looking at collaborating versus doing research that you yourself control entirely from inception to completion. What are some of the impediments to being more cooperative? What are some of the enablers, and what potentially are our next steps? What's something concrete that we as a group can advise the broader communities to do better? So just in general, high level, some of the things for collaborative research, and this is coming from the mind of somebody who's not a scientist by nature, who's a pilot and an astronaut. But in general, defining common research objectives is really, really important to this. That is a huge challenge because each agency, each investigator themselves all have different priorities. And some of the agencies are very constrained in how they can allocate the precious resources they have. For us, for example, it's a little bit difficult to get funding for basic research or maybe exploratory kinds of science. Our research, and with respect to human research, tends to be very constrained in that it supports the exploration missions, how to keep humans healthy and safe in space to do the kinds of, for the durations and the kinds of activities needed for exploration. So once you come up with your common research objectives, it looks easy when it's a single bullet like that, then putting out calls for proposals, getting ideas for that, and then jointly as a multi-agency effort, developing the research investigations. In a pure world, we do them all. It wouldn't be like the first couple of phases of additional rejuvenated cooperation we've come up with using the MERPI model, for example, but later on, you'd like to be able to jointly decide what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and do that in an international effort. Then jointly develop the ground rules for how you're going to share the resources, how you're going to allocate those on orbit, on the ground, who's going to develop the hardware, who's going to have how much time are you going to have available to it, its power, its volume, it's lots and lots of other things. But sharing those resources, figuring that out is pretty complicated, as is how you do the data sharing afterwards. And is it enough? And it probably is not, to just share the data after it's post-processing, or do we want to share tissues and samples and so forth? I'd argue the latter. The publication plan, how we do that, and whether we're publishing in the Russian peer-reviewed journals, or all the international ones that represented by the sponsor countries that work on that research. So we, I think, believe that all of them should. Now, there's also a wealth of data that already exists right now that's very difficult to get a hold of, and it's in printed form only, and it may only be in Russian, and it may be in the technical libraries of IBMP. We probably probably have lots of data as well. So if you, as an investigator, want to mine the literature for what's been done on solute, for example, that could be really tough, perhaps. So maybe there's a way that we can make some of that more available to us in a PLOS One or PubMed kind of open means. And then prioritizing and selecting and executing investigations. If we only have 7 or 11 years left, then figuring out who gets that limited time and what are the most important objectives, where are the big risks, and efforts have been made to identify those. And if we have a limited amount of crew time or money or power on board, who gets to do what and when. So the benefits for cooperative research, we all learn from each other. We learn how to work together on this and future activities, including the exploration activities themselves. We have to maximize ISS utilization. By being cooperative, we do exactly that. If we increase the subject sample size so that the U.S. segment crew members, be they ESA or JAXA or CSA or NASA, are participating in the Russian science and vice versa, then we increase that sample size. We only have 7-11 years remaining of service life. It looks like it improves our efficiency if we're maximizing ISS utilization, and it eliminates redundancy and gaps in research. So our thought on this here is if we, one of the other benefits is if we do more of the cooperative, we take this opportunity in the home stretch before space station's retired, and we do more cooperative research, it allows us to establish and re-energize existing partnerships for future collaboration and exploration. So when we leave low Earth orbit, we're going to do it arm in arm using the space station model, the most successful model for an international endeavor arguably ever. And it's exactly how we're going to do it in the future. So it's going to be collaborative, it's going to be cooperative. And then these added, the 5 and 6 are kind of are collateral sorts of benefits. So cooperation on space station research, it's a very high visibility, it's very impactful for us, of course, but it's a good way to demonstrate to our governmental leadership how important this is and the kinds of things you can do when you work together. And then I would argue from the perspective of a crew member, it enhances crew safety. The more time I spend in the service module, the more time that Anton Shkaplerov spends in the U.S. laboratory, the more familiar both of us are with all of our respective equipment, independent of merely the equipment using for the experiments. But I think we need to always remember, and the crew has to be thinking in these terms, we have one space station, we have one crew. We don't have segments. We have one station, one crew, and that crew needs to be as comfortable with every aspect of that station. They should be able to close their eyes and imagine how all the equipment works from stem to stern, from bow to stern on the space station. And by doing more cooperative research from the crew's perspective, it makes us safer. So the challenges for this, and some of these I think were brought up, the first 2 points were, Julie, I think, brought up on the first session where I wasn't there that first day, but some of the challenges for cooperative research is the scientists need to agree to share the data. The science itself needs to be peer-reviewed in all sponsor countries, mentioned that earlier, and the science needs to be funded by all sponsor countries. And if you're doing bilateral kinds of cooperative research, like fluid shifts, like field tests, some of the things that were very successfully done during the one-year mission and subsequent, as you bring on more and more partners, and they weren't just bilateral, but from the equipment standpoint and the subject standpoint, I believe they were. But as you add more and more countries, if we make it truly international, all the partner agencies participate, then you multiplicatively increase potentially some of those challenges. So it's just something to keep in mind. And you need to agree up front on a joint publication plan. The commercialization of the ISS, I put it here as a challenge for cooperative research. It's a challenge because it's a change in how we imagine using the space station. But half of the research assets on station are to be dedicated to the national lab and through cases. And so how we manage that piece of it, it's a different way of thinking. It incorporates other challenges with it, but it also probably opens up a lot of opportunities. So it's not entirely just a downside by any means. The impediments to cooperative research it's a pretty long list. So funding is always one of the scarcest resources. Crew time, and how we share and how we allocate cosmonaut time in the U.S. Research, for example, or vice versa. How we manage all that. Each partner agency is allocated a certain amount of hours on for a given expedition, and that can be very, very constraining sometimes. But ultimately, you need the crew to do the work, whether they're the subjects or the actual co-investigators executing the science up there. But that's a very limited commodity as well. Training demands on the ground, that's also can be a big challenge, because it is a very difficult thing to shoehorn in all the required training that a crew needs to get to be able to fly a 1 million pound space station for 6 months. And to do that in 2 years, or most recently with Joe Acaba, for example, in 6 months, deciding what you really, no kidding, need to have during that very limited time period where you have them on the ground is really tough. We also have training we do on orbit, so a lot of the training you can put off till the crew gets up there and do just-in-time training. Schedule constraints on the crew on board, of course, for the researchers on the ground, the hardware itself, and the allocation of those resources. Segmented operations, this mindset where we have for a long time been in, where we think of it as there being 2 space stations, is extremely detrimental to the integrity of the crew as a single crew. It's also very detrimental to how you operate it. If you're a program manager or if you're a science researcher, you don't want to have that. You don't want to be limited by the fact that you've got effectively 2 space stations, and that maybe 2 or 3 of the crew members are essentially off limits to you and not available. All those resources should be available, and we ought to think about maximizing their use all the time. Conflicting research priorities, whether they're institutionally mandated or basically limits to the scope of what previous research done by a given group was, those are an issue as well. So if you had a good international group that could sit there and identify all those risks, periodically review them, review them, and decide how to go about solving those, and do it in a way that everybody agrees is key. There's organizational constraints on how we work and so forth at maybe at the IBMP level, or at NASA's level, or HRP, or any of the other groups. We all answer to bosses in our respective agencies and lab directors and so forth. So there's all those things could be impediments. Geographical separation is a huge one, but if anybody should be able to figure out how to work around that, it ought to be a program that's international and involves people flying off the surface of the Earth. By definition, the crew is always going to be geographically separated. We can do this. We fly the thing remotely from Houston, from Moscow, from all the control centers around the world, and we do it very successfully. We, on the research side, ought to be able to do the same thing and capitalize on that experience. If you as a researcher are going to collaborate with a program or project that you had, that is always going to, in your perspective, at some level involve sacrificing some measure of control. It's not all your lab, all your equipment, all your design that you own. You're ceding some of that control to the folks you collaborate with. There's data sharing barriers. Some of these are really pretty intractable. So on the medical privacy side, that's a huge deal, as are proprietary data sharing constraints. So if you're doing commercial research, for example, CASIS, sponsored research on station for a company that expects to get return on investment on whatever that thing is they're working on, that is a critical part of their bottom line going forward. It's hugely in their interest to limit the release of that. Managing how we do that should not be impossible. We've been doing this all the way back since, Space Lab missions, where we had international investigations, some of which involved proprietary considerations. We managed and navigated that successfully. We're just going to be faced with doing more of that in the future. By definition, all the things that we do in space, or many of the things we do in space, can be impeded or restricted by export control considerations, because it's dual-use technology. So there are very, very stringent rules for that. There's also potentially data sharing barriers, institutional and otherwise, too. There's I mentioned that already, pressure to generate return on investment for commercial investigations. Way down the list, I think, because we've practiced these quite a bit, I think our language and culture. We manage through that pretty well. And politics also could be potentially an impediment. We're a pretty politics-free, political-free zone, which is a good thing. enablers for cooperative research. It's a shorter list than the impediments, but we have some great collaborative relationships that have been in work for a long, long time at the investigation level and all the way up to some of the international boards and panels like the ISIL, SWIG, and MRPI, and we'll talk about those in a little bit some more. I think I'd argue that the crews right now are much more interested in doing the science that you are sponsoring and proposing than maybe they had been in the shuttle days, certainly. So even if you have, even the pilots and engineers and other folks among the crews, I think nobody that would be inclined to just fly in space for the fun of it remains in the space program. Everybody up there is delighted to be able to actually be a part of the research, and I think that's a new model relatively in the last 20 years or so, 10 years. We're going to grow the crew size from 6 to 7 once we start flying U.S. crewed vehicles. We hope it'll be next year. We'll see. But that'll be a help. So you'll get more crew time available. I think if you have commitment on the part of leadership, and I say if there's strong commitment on the part of leadership, that could be a great enabler for cooperative research as well. We have some recent experience with joint research, 2 really successful investigations, field tests and fluid shift that kind of act as pathfinders and kind of show us the way on how we can apply it to future plans like that. I would say that going back to the crew size, although we're going from 6 to 7, space station's getting a little long in the tooth. So space where the crews are spending more time doing maintenance-like activities on station because we're well beyond the initial, design life of station. So you're getting a little bit more time, but you're losing a little bit in what they have to do to keep the station flying. So I want to talk about MRPI real quick, and this was a deep dive for me just recently, and thanks to the membership of the Group A yesterday for our discussion to help educate me, and I did a little more research. But anyways, MRPI is a multilateral human research panel for exploration. You all know this, I'm sure, but it was established in 2013 with the Space Station Control Board Charter to increase collaborative research opportunities on ISS, which is exactly what our charter was here, is to figure out ways to do it. So I think there's a strong argument, and I think a lot of the membership of the panel yesterday would agree that it would be nice to go and take some metrics on how they've done since that 2013 inception and see if MRPI has done what its mandate laid out for it to do. And if not, let's find ways to re-energize, rejuvenate it. So the charter was modeled after the MMOP, including hardware and data sharing principles, which is kind of exactly, initially I was thinking, hey, we need, because the MMOP is a very successful international panel that is mandated to take care of crew health. And it's a little bit more discreet. It's near term. It's keep the crew healthy and productive in space. That's a little bit different than maybe figure out how to enable the crew to more successfully do extremely long duration missions like the MRPI was dedicated to. My thinking was we would like to have like an MROP, a multilateral research operations panel, but that's what MRPI is. So it was actually designed using the model of the MMOP. Its forerunner was the Team 5 Health Management Team under the IEWG. It's the Team 5's role, as laid out and proposed in 2012, was to leverage ISS international medical research community to identify the top human health and performance risks associated with Mars missions. So it was exploration, focused on exploration. This is Team 5. And then by 2020, they had to identify the plans to study and mitigate those risks. So there's a list of about 12 risks, some of which have a lot of red on them, some of which have some green, a little bit of yellow. But it was to identify those risks and then establish a process to regularly, frequently assess the research progress and then brief the heads of agency and the multilateral control board. So I don't know the status on what and I don't know if anybody here is on the membership of MRPI, and if your general sense is that things are marching along, well in that respect. But anyways, MRPI oversaw the NASA implementation of multilateral research program for the 1-year mission. So there was an urgency, a sense of immediacy to really engage shortly after they were created to spearhead the multilateral efforts associated with the one-year mission. We had a launch date coming up, we had a crew assigned, we had to collect data, and so that was kind of that's what lit the fire under that panel to get things going. So I don't know, and this is again me speaking as a non-scientist, non-researcher, not close to all this, but there may be an argument for us to find the next field test, the next kinds of investigations. So go through that list of risks that are there, which include radiation, which include autonomous emergency, which include the ocular, neuroocular syndrome, and a few other things that we potentially could now go and offer that up, or encourage those of you who are on MERPI, encourage that to be the next focus. Again, the clock is marching down, and there's not that much more time that we have on station. So some of the next steps we could do, independent of MERPI even, but we could continue and expand on recent cooperative investigations. So look at the things we're doing right now and expand those as we can. Expand the scope of any MOUs and collaborative research agreements we have. So it would be good to, in light of the fact that the clock's winding down here, to look at all those kinds of mechanisms that are out there that guide us how we work, guide us in how we work together, and see if there's a way to rejuvenate those. We can leverage high visibility multinational aspect of cooperative research to help gain governmental buy-in and funding. So promoting the fact that we're doing this, and the one-year mission had a very good bully pulpit, and it was and had a lot of visibility. And there's probably other things maybe we can do on station to help tell that story in a very public way. Expand ISIL-SWIG membership to include our Russian colleagues. So that would, I think, be also a very good way to make that truly a multilateral. We've got a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge, and not in denying that to the ISIL-SWIG membership at that forum, I think, is probably not necessarily the wisest. Expand, so we always talk about, using ISS as a national lab. It's designated as a national lab, U.S. lab, like Los Alamos, like Brookhaven, like these other laboratories, and so it has that level. But if we collectively, as an international space station partnership, think of it as an international lab, an ISS international lab, I think maybe that's a useful way. As a potential next step to improve cooperative research. So then expanding and energizing MERPI, so looking at all those research risks that are out there, and some of the things you could add are listed in number 7. So there's some things we can do right now. We actually have a little bit of a surplus of crew time on board station right now as the science is gradually catching up, and if we have that surplus of crew time, there's some things that we can do that don't require a lot in the way of facilities or onboard investigations, but you could, for example, do a lot of very dense, from a spatial and temporal standpoint, sampling of the environment, the surfaces on space station right now, and then get all those swabs and samples, just return them to the ground, sequence, and characterize the microbiome of space station. We are making decisions right now. In fact, some of them, the horses left the barn. We're making decisions right now on the materials, the panels, the paints and so forth that we use on the Orion capsule. It would be helpful if we could inform those decisions based on a characterization of this incredible 20-year on-orbit experience with space station. We could do that. That would be relatively easily. We have the EM1 Orion capsule is already it's in the middle of its functional testing down at Kennedy Space Center. Parts and pieces and parts are all welded in there. It'd be real hard to change panels and so forth, but we're already deciding how we're going to make things like a HAB airlock and a deep space gateway and the hardware that goes with it, and also the deep space transport. That stuff it's actually hardware that's being built right now, and to build it without taking advantage, leveraging the experience we already have on space station in a relatively simple way that we could do this seems to be a mistake. So, and Becky Blue and lots of others have talked about radiation. It's one of the it's one of those mostly read risks on that 12 or so item list that Team 5 had identified. And I know there's lots of arguments about whether or not that the low Earth orbit environment really is representative of what a deep space environment would be with respect to radiation. And so we are leaning towards doing these studies in the ground, but it's really hard to replicate on the ground the true radiation environment that we have in deep space. Why not do both, with biodosimetry and biomarkers? So it's red. It's on that list of risks. If there are things we can do in space right now, if we have crew time, if we've got the sensors and various different kinds of equipment that we could fly up there that are small, why not start collecting data on that as soon as we can? So VIP and SANS, that's another one of the red risks. So space-associated neuroocular syndrome, and one of these shockingly very late discoveries. That's why we do exploration like this, but it wasn't. We've been flying people for an awful long time with that experience that were people that were basically dismissing it as, well, I just got old, now I just don't see as well. So what other things are out there, I don't know, but we could actually do some work on that potentially. So that's the potential next steps. I don't think I really have a whole lot more to talk about on it. I think it was a great discussion. It would be nice coming out of one of these to have a white paper, to have something to present, but we maybe have all the membership, we have all of the tendrils out into the key organizations that this would perhaps benefit. And so I think the most logical way to rejuvenate some of this cooperative research in this narrowing window is probably through MERPI. So, and if you have any comments or suggestions, if you have anything, I think we're just going to do the outbriefs, but I'd welcome, all the comments you already gave me were wonderful. I'd love to hear more, and we can incorporate all those and get that in something like a more formal white paper that we leave with ISMAS.
Any comments or questions?
Thank you, Dan. One interesting observation I've seen is that being a physicist, in my background, is that physicists has a long tradition of working together in bigger groups, international collaborations, and that is not so common in particularly biology. I think medicine maybe more. So that's also something one can look at to see what a physicist is doing and working together. But it's great to see how it's really improved a lot since the 2013 kind of task fire and everything's got going.
Right. Yeah, hi, Bonnie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great report. And just echoing back on a comment I made earlier in the meeting, we solved some of this when we did Space Lab flights, and they were very short duration. We had investigator working groups. We had the IML series and the D1 series and so forth. But as we go forward, just to remind everyone that the Association of Space Explorers is also working on a position paper.
Okay.
So we can, mostly for those people who have left the office internationally to help collaborate on data. So to the extent that we can help with this, and I have your notes, and we'll probably put out that white paper in about 9 months.
Okay.
Let us know, because I think there'll be some strength in positions there.
Excellent. Okay. And you have a much more public voice, perhaps than we have, and that could probably be a really good thing to help promote this.
Yeah, and Oleg, if he's here, Kotov is on.
Yep.
Yeah, there he is. So we have a small working group that's international in our executive committee, and we're part of that. So we're working from an international position as well.
Fantastic. Okay. Yes.
This was a great summary, a very ambitious list.
Yeah.
But I really do hope that our Russian colleagues heard very clearly yesterday that many of us who have no facility with the Russian language, very much would love to learn from the deep database that they have accumulated over the last decades. And they clearly have far more experience than the Americans in long-duration spaceflight. They were doing nearly year missions long before we did. So if there were any means of getting some of those pivotal publications translated and archived and available electronically, that would be a huge step forward. And one kind of modest proposal, I don't think people will argue with the outline you have presented here. They're all laudable goals, but we know that there's many obstacles to large agencies retooling and working together on collaborative big projects. Could the joint agencies decide on one project, one collaborative project to run as a test a test, from the get-go.
From inception,
And
right.
then to use that. And of course, you've had the fluid shift work is perhaps a good test model even to work from right now to identify what are the key barriers, what are the stumbling steps that we need to focus on, which you have probably identified in the list above, but I suspect there are some behind-the-scenes issues that make it difficult sometimes to work out these differences. So if even working from the fluid shifts work, it might be easy to see or expand on it, but as a test pilot, for this kind of vision.
So one thing, it's really difficult for us to travel. I mean, in general, it's just hard to get everybody together in one place. And then the data sharing issues, whether it's proprietary, whether it's medical privacy or potentially EAR and so forth, that's a hard thing too. So Isabel, we were talking earlier this morning about how it would be great to be able to have so we at NASA right now are struggling with the same data sharing thing. So we're working on Commercial Crew, we're working on Orion, we're working on all these things, and we're doing it in a way now we're getting very handy with the tools that allow us to maintain the protection for the information. Whether it's the firewalling and the non-disclosure kinds of things, but also the encryption, and we have means to do video conferences that are just as good as any you've done before, and we have international partnerships on this that are all there, and we have the tools. It's just a matter of kind of repurposing some of those for the research kind of goals. So it's not like you have to reinvent some of those. So that might be a helpful thing in general. And then this idea of maybe having the proposal on the end there was to pick a couple next ones. Let's go to that list of risks and find some other ones that we hit as our next targets. Ines.
I just would like to add that yesterday it was the discussion was extremely hot, and actually everybody who was participating, it was seen that everybody was interested, had his own thoughts, suggested different things, and so on. But there was one thing which repeatedly appeared, that we found out, and we have to think about it, that actually we don't have representation of what we are doing on the board is not available for the whole society which participate in this our flights. It means that different country and different agency, they have their own conference lists, and so people know a little bit about ourselves.
That's it.
But now we are talking not about ourselves. We are talking about multiple plans. So people, yesterday it was interesting that few people even told us that they have doubts that on the station we are not working maybe even very active and very good, because information about what's going on, what we achieved, what is our priority list for the future, it is not available actually, and therefore many people yesterday, many of us, the panel was a lot of people came to participate. I was even surprised, and everybody wanted to participate, and few of them said, why don't we have just our conference on what on the results of what we achieved on our station? I think that's, and we talked yesterday, and we said that we will bring it here for our agency and our chiefs to listen. I think it is necessary for them to do, besides the list of what was done according to plan of this agency, what was done on the station. Station is flying 18 years. What was done in our life sciences, and that's not yeah, I cannot agree with that maybe in physics or in some other area there was done something more, because at least on our side, I mean on Russian side, when we look through hundreds experiments which were done on the station, the life science is the most active, the most multiple, the most numerous. But if you will ask me, what was done, what was achieved, what did you do during all this, what our people, with whom we are working, I would not, even me, who are working very
nobody could be closer.
actively in this area. So I think that in spite of many conferences which we are providing, there should be the conferences, and I would say periodically, systematically, which will be concentrated on what was achieved, what was already shown. And there, during this discussion, they will be also decided what is the priorities of the next steps. Thank you very much.
It's a great point. And another, but before you weigh in, another thing that another impediment is, of course, anybody who's a researcher, you don't want to publish those results before you've had a chance to fully analyze them too. So there's also that. There's, so I finished my last flight in 2012, 5 years later, and probably 2/3 of our investigations, even if I were to ask the PIs for the data, it's not available yet because they still want to make sure they get everything locked down. So that's an added impediment that is just part and parcel with science and how it's done, probably necessarily. But not necessarily, no, this is for public release. But for the group that is working this, why can't we have these status, sessions where people, understand how things have been progressing on that last set of investigations 2 months ago and how that might inform what the next couple of data takes are?
I'm sorry, that's good for American side, but not good for Russian side.
Yeah.
We do not have financing to travel.
Yeah.
The only way could be the organization of international website devoted to the results of...
That's just not true, Vadim. I'm sorry.
У вас есть деньги? Это хорошо. I'm sorry. Let me finish. I think that now in Europe there is a new magazine called Reach. This magazine receives only reviews devoted to the certain areas of space medicine and biology. So it's not American. That's why probably many American colleagues, they didn't hear and they didn't notice the appearance of the new magazine. But I strongly recommend, if you really want to know what was really obtained, you can subscribe to Reach. I'm not having any commercial interests. I'm just... it's not advertising, it's the advice. Speaking about the conferences. Conferences is a usual thing, and sometimes not all the people who are interested can attend. Again, using electronic ways like website made by our groups like MERPI, I think it will be more fruitful if, for example, without any barriers, I can send material in English, and that can be the equivalent of publication. Now it takes several months to publish, and of course it's not so easy. I think that website can work and can help. And if we, for example, arrange the subgroup of reviews and the fresh data or the subgroup of new ideas how to develop, it's very nice that this group mentioned 3 areas. I don't see my area, I'm not happy. There will be other people who will look at this list of priorities, and they will also not be happy because they are from different areas.
Okay.
So again, to make it really wide,
That's me.
make a website.
Right. So a great idea. I think I will definitely add the website. That's easy. That's something we can do. And the travel restrictions, which are the travel impediments, are absolutely real. I understand that. And I just put those 3 things down myself just from some of the discussions. But behavioral health and performance, that piece is also one of the red ones. on station. We talked about how difficult it is, though, sometimes to have station truly be an analog for some of the real challenges of sending a crew into exploration, on an exploration class mission where Earth is no longer at arm's reach out that cupola window, looking glorious and beautiful. You don't feel any proximity to it. It's indistinguishable from a star. The interpersonal kinds of challenges and so forth. So by rights, I take the hit. That should be on there. I understand, and it is a significant one. Yes?
Just wanted to follow up on what was just said there. The Reach Journal, I think, is actually a really nice place where if you were to write a white paper, it could be published and would have international impact.
Okay.
But even further than that, the Reach paper is from the International Astronautical Congress, or from the IAF, I should say. And the IAC is a place where the heads of agencies are, and all the top level administrators of agencies typically go one conference every year. And so presenting this white paper as a panel or a plenary at an event like that would essentially allow you to have hopefully access to upper echelons of leadership in all the different agencies. And if you truly want to develop a multilateral or multinational effort, that might be a really great place to start. And so you could discuss it there, have your panel or plenary, publish your white paper in the IAF journal, Reach, and use that as a starting point for developing these agreements and relationships that may not exist right now.
Okay. Great ideas. Great ideas. I'll definitely add all those in. Isabel.
On the discussion about collaborative tools, I think now that the tools that exist evolve so much that we should take advantage of this. Like meeting face-to-face, of course, will not be replaced, but by virtual or presence, or by having a web platform that is shared, where we can maybe exchange more quickly results from research, from investigations. But collaborative tools are very powerful. They can, like social media, allow a team of members of a committee around the world to exchange in real time, to chat in real time, to have access to each other quickly. Distance, of course, is difficult to work with, maybe except for the space station where everybody is looking at the same place. But I think that we can definitely take advantage of having a common web platform that is secured, where we can share progress, we can share action lists, we can share objectives, goals, we can share white papers, we can share different things. So we can get organized basically on those platforms and closely follow up on the work and have this live interaction, although we're all around the world.
Okay, very good.
Dan?
Yeah.
We have something that I helped establish over 10 years ago, the HRMRB, for bioethical review of all the proposals that fly on station. And that's based on video teleconferencing. It's worked extremely well. So I would suggest the way maybe to get this started is the leads for the international programs in each of the groups would get together and come up with those priorities that you listed on, I think it was number 7 of one of your charts. They'd pick the number 1 priority. Then I believe it's important that the potential investigators from each of those organizations meet face-to-face for a few days, one time. After that, I believe they could conduct the work of developing the proposal and everything else by video teleconference.
Okay, very good. So could we do this all as part of MERP's IT sources? So on their webpage, could there be links? Could there be a place to post white papers that's got preliminary data? Could there be a post for, you'd have those risks that are already identified that have been kind of prioritized in the sense that how red they are is depicted, and then use that, and then have the secure web-based collaboration tools all linkable from that. And that's basically what we do with Commercial Crew right now. Those are how we manage it. And then that in so doing, have the people from the various different areas that are involved in whichever particular risk it is be able to be voting and interacting and so forth on those different things. So seems totally doable. If we can't do remote, web-based kinds of, secure sorts of means to communicate, then we have no business flying space stations, period. We know how to do this. Yes. Yes, Larry.
Ted, two questions or two comments. Is this on?
Sometimes you'll turn it on, it'll turn green, it takes a couple seconds.
Two comments. One on collaboration and one on schedules. On collaboration, Bonnie has a few times this week talked about the effectiveness of investigative working groups. Mm-hmm. They were extremely effective during the Space Lab era. They do require travel, but once you get to know one another, then you become part of a discipline-oriented team rather than a national representative.
Okay.
That's worth reconsidering.
Good.
Second, on schedules and making data available. In some of the sciences, it is required by the funding agencies to release your data within a year of the mission. I believe that's the case of the planetary sciences. The problem, of course, is that the release of the data without sufficient explanation makes it rather foggy and difficult to use. But one might consider having some kind of international guidelines upon about the time at which the data no longer belongs to the principal investigator, but must be released.
Okay. Very good.
Dan, real quick. I think that Chris brought up a great point, so did everyone else's. Vladim's brought up a great point. One thing that I think that we saw is the progression of activities across the many years we've been at this conference, and I'd like to charge the group to actually put a white paper out and charge the group to present the outcomes of this over the 12-month period back at the conference. I think that white paper is very powerful, so let's see progress and move in what's going on, whether it's the utilization of Murphy, whether it's building these groups, whether it's a scorecard for Murphy, whether it's the integration of the Russians into Isselzwig, whatever that is. But let's see some movement and traction so that next year we're having an update of what's happened in that 12-month period that's facilitated that collaboration. And then from that, put a marker in the sand and let's move forward and update that on a regular basis.
Okay. Saglasna. Agreed. Great idea. Okay.
Thank you, Dan.
I think that is it. Thank you all very, very much. And white paper it is, and I'll incorporate all those latest comments into that as well. So thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I will play my role in getting us back on schedule here, as I often do. We had a great discussion yesterday on analogs, a little more lively than I thought, but I thought it was all really wonderful. In fact, I wish we could have continued that discussion, but we ran out of time. I think we all agree that analogs are important. We've been using analogs since the beginning in that we've always had simulators and trainers, and you can think of a simulator or a trainer as a small-scale analog. Analogs, of course, became much more important as we started flying longer missions and flying aboard ISS, where we started using analogs both as a training tool as well as a discriminator, if you will, for figuring out which candidates would be good ones for long duration flight. And I think we all agree that as we start talking about exploration class missions and going farther and deeper and longer into space, that analogs will become even more important. So we carried that energy into our discussion about analogs, and we talked a little bit about some of these subjects, and then we came up with an idea. Let's write down some questions that we would like to have answered. And so we went around and we collected 16 questions. And we discussed those. We distilled some of them down into, together. We eliminated a few others, and we pretty much came down with 3 questions and 2 comments that I'd like to talk about now. The first is, what is the role of analogs? And so as we talked about before, of course, it's a training device, it's a discriminator, but it's also very useful, of course, for research, right? A lot of research work has gone into or has come out of analog studies. Also, it's useful as an ops development tool. right? Develop your operations concepts and input into your ConOps. The other thing it can be used for, of course, to a more limited degree, is testing new equipment. Of course, it's only as good as your simulator there. So the second question was, what are the gaps and the associated costs? Now, we all recognize that there are limitations to analogs, right? We talked about them during the panel discussion yesterday. The people inside know they're in a simulation. They know they're not actually on a trip to Mars or, even to the ISS. And so there's only so much you can do. The people inside know that if you're there inside of a chamber, that if something goes really bad or they get unhappy enough that there is a hatch that can be opened and you can come out and end the simulation. Luca brought up a very interesting point at the panel. He says, we have this concern, and it is a real concern, that on a trip to Mars, there's not going to be enough for the crew to do. Right, and so that's going to affect your outlook, could affect your morale, things like that. But Luca said, you know what? If I'm no kidding on my way to Mars, I'm going to be excited about it. And I can put up with 260 days of not doing anything, because I know I'm going to Mars. Whereas in a simulation, that's not true. And so then we brought up the idea of this incentivization. Could you provide an incentive to this simulation, the members that are participating, to give kind of that same idea. Like if you finish the simulation, you go all the way through, you're going to get, say, a cash bonus, right? I mean, that would I think that would change the dynamic. It'd be very interesting. And, we have some information, and that was also a question that I had, is, the Phase 1 U.S. astronauts that flew aboard Space Station Mir, frankly, they didn't have enough to do. And a few of them were very outspoken publicly about the morale they suffered, the lower morale, and at least one case, this person changed drastically from who he was before to who he was afterwards. So it was pretty profound, and obviously something we can talk about. But what if in those cases, there was actually some kind of incentive? The cosmonauts get a bonus after flight. The Americans do not. In fact, I've had more than one Russian, not cosmonauts, more than one Russian ask me while I was training, what kind of a bonus do American astronauts get for long duration flight? So we don't get any bonus. And they said, well, why do you fly? So that was really interesting. So what are the gaps and the associated costs? We'd like to, the incentivization is an interesting thing to discuss. We'd like to see more international crews. Of course, we have seen plenty of those crews put together. We talked about training a little bit. One thing that's a little artificial, okay, so you train a crew that's going to go into a simulation for a few months together. That's great. That's certainly better than none, no interaction together. But in the case of training to go to ISS, the group gets together, and generally, if you're a newbie into that pool, you have to train to be a backup first, and so that you end up training together with this group of people for several years, and so then it becomes more obvious, which people are going to work better together and things like that. So that's another thing that could be, of course, we don't expect that you train a crew that's going into sim for years, but that kind of, was just a point that was brought up. Also, we talked about autonomous operations as we start talking about sending crews farther and longer into space with time delays with communication and other technical issues like that. Crews are going to have to be more autonomous. And Shep brought up his experience during Expedition 1, where basically they had things that they just decided to do. And you get Shep and Don Pettit on board, and you could have a whole new space station or a whole new spacecraft by the time you arrive at Mars, right? And so that was something that was brought up there. Mission control analogs, at the same time that you're running a crew inside a chamber, the people outside controlling the mission control, that is an opportunity that shouldn't be overlooked. This is also a chance not only to train a crew inside or do your research inside, but you should also be training your mission control team outside, controlling the sim inside. Let's see, what else did we have here? think that's what we had on the gaps. Okay, the third question that we asked is, what is the role of commercial companies going forward? Now, this is not anything new. We've actually been using commercial companies all along. When we started doing long-duration flight or preparing for long-duration flight, we contracted out to entities like Outward Bound and NOLS, and National Outdoors Leadership Program. And so we ran astronauts through those programs as kind of an analog. We also contracted out to Zero G Corporation for all our parabolic flights, NASA did. And so when our friends here from Blue Abyss, if they make their own neutral buoyancy lab, certainly the model exists on how we might do that. And one question they had in particular was, how do we flow requirements down to these commercial entities? And so I don't know specifically how we used to do that, but Zero G Corp would be a place to look at how they were able to satisfy NASA's requirements for Zero G parabolic flights. Two comments. One was the importance of keeping up with technology to enhance your analog. And one in specific point that was brought up was virtual reality, and how could virtual reality be used to enhance your analog and make it more realistic. And let's see. Actually, yeah, that and the mission. Yeah, I guess the mission control analog was the other comment, but I incorporated that into the gap. So basically, that's pretty much what we came up with. And with that, I think we're back on schedule, and we'll take any questions.
Leroy, I think it was your second point, was how you incentivize subjects for analog studies. I'll just say you have to be cautious in your approach because it's a slippery slope. Some bioethicists would say that you are coercing those subjects into participating by holding out this carrot at the end of the study.
Right.
We ran into a little of that down at UTMB when we started bed rest studies there many, many years ago. Their own bioethics group felt that perhaps even the minimal compensation that the subjects were going to be given was a coercion to participate. So just keep that in mind. No,
that's a great point. And I don't know, I'm certainly no expert on that. I understand what you're saying, and I don't know how you get around that because, the model that I think of right away is the oil companies and getting folks to go out and live out in the desert and drill for oil. They're paid pretty big bonuses to go do that.
The difference is
on shelf and so on.
Yeah. No, I understand. Your point is very well taken, Chuck, and I understand. My limited experience with the human subject testing and all that. I know it can be quite a slippery slope. Yeah.
I'd like to touch on that as well a little bit. So part of, I think, maybe where Luca was coming from was, he's an astronaut. He's been to space, and so the incentive of pretending that you're going to Mars, it's not really there for him. But from somebody who's not an astronaut, who's not actually done the actual act of being there, might make a difference. I just got out of a HERA study, and we had halfway through the mission we were getting to an asteroid, and that was a high incentive. We were trying to play the role and be in there. And that was an incentive to, that we were excited to be there and do the additional tasks and stuff like that. So it might, be a little different coming from a non-astronaut, I guess.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying, and that kind of goes a little bit to what Dave Dinges was talking about yesterday, that in order to have a high-fidelity analog, you want to try to get as much as possible the right group together, the people that are going to be somewhat representative of operational thinkers, of people who either fly aircraft or are astronauts themselves. But I understand. Thanks.
Leroy, just expanding a little bit on that gaps point two. So looking ahead at future activities, whether it be Gateway, whether it be Moon, whether it be Mars, activities that simply aren't being done now. So the question is, what facilities might be needed or will be needed for those future activities that don't exist today? And of course, what is the cost of those facilities?
Right.
That's something that really needs to be looked at.
Right. Well, as far as the gateway goes, I think, it's basically, you can think of it as a small human-tended space station, although it's orbiting the moon instead of the Earth. So I would say the space station is probably a good analog for that. But, surface operations comes to mind. We haven't sent people to the moon since 1972. And so having a good analog for surface operations would be something that would be wanted and desired.
I have two comments, if you allow me. First one is the same idea that we heard a couple of minutes ago. We need an article internationally published where there will be description of all that analogs. I know about the existence of very nice and sophisticated NASA report. Of course, we must not make a copy of it and publish, but I think NASA people can make a digest and publish. So not necessary to explain what analogs are and how they can be used, because that description in that report is full enough to understand how to use and what to use. Second comment, again similar to my comment to the previous session. Again, we need an international website for the analogs. For example, speaking about Sirius, I made some advertising. In this case, I'm interested to make advertising, but it seems that even in the US, despite it was under the contract with NASA, not all the PIs are aware about it. And I really a little bit annoyed, let's say, by the fact that not all my colleagues whom I want to invite are invited. And in this case, it's not that convenient for me to invite them in person, because NASA is one of the organizers. I cannot do it instead of NASA. But if there will be a website, I think it will be clear what are the options, and what is going on in Hera will be known not only to the American colleagues, what is going on in JAXA, and their simulator will be known to more people. So that will help us to avoid redundancy and really step forward.
Excellent comments, and I agree. I think that's something that cuts across all the different topics we've been discussing is, how do we inform each other and communicate within the limitations of, face-to-face meetings, which of course are best, but certainly electronic means are very effective and efficient.
Yeah, sorry, I'll bring back again on the hit part of the panel yesterday about this analog. Well, first of all, I think that there was a term used in a negative way, like boring. The 260 days, if they're boring, is good, right? That's what you're really looking for. You wish to be bored.
You want your spacecraft falling apart, right?
As incentive, I think that one of the quickest things I could think is that, what if it's like a requirement to go to Mars, do an analog first. However, I do think that ask an astronaut probably to dedicate, at that point, 4 or 5 years of his life to go to Mars might be a little too much, but maybe something to think about it.
Right, yeah, I don't know about having to simulate an entire Mars mission before going. That would be interesting. Right. Any more? Yeah, Bonnie?
So we've had this recommendation in several other areas about collecting all the data in one place. And we actually had an analog for Skylab in the United States called SMEET, right? And with the researchers and the Skylab crew in there. It would be nice to see all of that in one place, and to collect the results kind of in one place, and also understand from the participants' point of view, hear from them as well. I think that would be an added value.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Agree. Yeah, Vanessa?
I'm listening with interest to the discussion from year to year about analogs. And I think that's extremely important, that the discussion about analogs, and it means development of the analog business going in proper direction. because it's going to work with analog or develop analogs for flights, for going where we think that we will go, maybe sooner or later and so on. But at the same time, what bothers me is that analog of those factors which act not on psychology, on behavior, performance, but on our body. Somehow this discussion disappears, but it's not. It is wrong, because if you will not perform those experiments in which we replicate the influence effects of factors which changes the situation inside the body, then we will not go anywhere as well. Like there is bed rest which are still going, as a matter of fact. And somehow, because of course, not any, even the most rich agency don't have money enough to perform good, full size analog, physiological and psychological. Now somehow we turn toward psychology. But it is very important to remember that psychology and physiology, they are
linked,
actually two sides of the very same thing. It is better if they go together. Like we were providing in Russia isolation study, but we think about this and we hope that in our future steps in this long-term isolation, we will have isolation plus immersion plus bed rest. It means we will add those factors which affect not psychology primary, but affect primary the body function. But because of body function are changed, the psychology is also changed. So it should, I think that we should think more about complex analogical studies.
No, that's very interesting. I suppose you could add to it by having the subjects in the analogs head down tilt and get the fluid shift and all that, really make their lives miserable. But I guess just thinking out loud, that would also affect your analog study in that they would have to spend a lot of time kind of doing nothing, or just to get kind of mimic the physiological changes of zero gravity instead of simulating doing other tasks and things like that. So I guess it would be kind of a balance. And of course, ISS, our 6-month ISS missions certainly can, is an analog for that piece of it. But certainly understand and agree with you that how you feel physically and your mood or your psychology is very much linked, right? We know that. I can tell you firsthand from our food shortage how that affects your morale.
I think that very soon we will already have deal with working on surface of the moon.
Yes.
Because otherwise, what for do we need moon for a long time if we will not work there? So it will require from us a very big, much stuff, work, biomechanics and so on, to study the effect of this changed gravity situation on our ability to work. I like very much all these films about Apollo, but it was absolutely, for me as physiologist who is involved in sensory motor study, but that so far they cannot work there. They hardly can survive thinking about how they will move from here to there.
Right.
But we need to work there. So it means we need to create the situation where these factors, which will meet them on moon, would be introduced to them, and we physiologists like Larry and myself and the other, we will have the task to develop the understanding how and what we should do to make people capable to work effectively on this surface.
Right.
So I'm not against the this line of research which was lately became like mostly in analog, but not to forget to work in the not to forget the other lines as well.
Right. Agree. Thank you.
Leroy,
Yes.
I just something came to mind that we didn't discuss, but I think it's a very important aspect. I don't know how you create an analog for this, but I think that there's tremendous stress on people's families when you're having missions that are 3-4 years in length. And so,
Right.
I don't know that we should have people get divorces just to practice. but
Or maybe prophylactically, like having your appendix
removed.
removed.
I've been in
right?
environments where the separation and divorce rate is like 70-80%, and it's extremely adverse to the performance of the individuals in the group. I don't know that we expect that on long missions, but it's something that we ought to think about. When we first started this in the service, this started appearing. We had a chaplain, and the service member would come in, and the chaplain would say, how about a cup of coffee, son? Let's sit down and talk about this, and counseling and all that. And it got to be such a parade of people filing for divorce that it got down to an assembly line where people walked down a row of tables, and the chaplain said, "Hey, Bob, what state are you from?" And he said, "Okay, Kentucky. The forms you need to fill out are over here." I mean, it was a production line. And I just think it's an aspect of the training and preparation environment. I don't know how we get to that in terms of analogs, but at least we ought to talk about it.
No, that's an important point, and I think I don't know what the numbers are, but I've heard that the divorce rate of astronauts and cosmonauts are higher than average, and certainly in the service when people are deployed overseas in hazardous conditions, no trouble believing that it's higher there too. But how does the military? I mean, I guess they tried to do this counseling, but then kind of shifted just to figure out how to expedite the process for folks. I mean, if the military hasn't been able to figure out how to deal with that, I'm not sure how we are, because they've got a lot higher end to go through. But definitely something worth considering.
Does the behavioral health support folks deal with, preventative marital issues?
Let's see. Aboard ISS, you mean? I think they try, in that they provide you with movies and books and teleconferences with your family, things like that. But frankly, and I think it varies across individuals. For me, just being able to use the IP phone and call down, and then having the email access, so you can send notes to a lot of people. You can send photographs to specific photographs to some of your family members or friends that mean something to them. That really took care of it for me. But like I said, it's very individual, I think, across what works. Yep.
Thank you. We've looked at it in our element a couple of times, and one of the things we looked at was virtual reality and family connection. The difficulty there is, just like in a military environment, if you're planning on connecting and the person you're planning on connecting with forgets, so at the early part of the analog,
right,
there was lots of connecting.
Right.
And so when the participant would reach out, great, everything worked well. But as the mission proceeded, the individual who's isolated reaches out, but the person's not there.
Right.
And they sort of go on with their life. And that's part of what happens with the stresses and strains and relationships. Now, we just funded one study, and David Dinges and his team are looking at this. We're going to look at the biological processes that occur when you make the social connection. So during the mission, there will be social opportunities, and then we'll assess biomarker changes like oxytocin to see what happens to the individual when there is somebody there and when there isn't, to make sure that we understand better what is happening psychologically and physiologically. To reinforce Vanessa's point, the two do go together. And all you have to do is reflect on, if you feel okay and you come in of a morning and someone says, gosh, are you feeling okay? You don't look so well. Well, at that point, psychologically, you start to feel worse because of that connection between the two. And that's what we have to better understand. What's happening long term when there is that distance, and when you feel, because what tends to happen in the military, people who deploy tend to leave, and they pretty much stay the same socially within the relationship. But the person you've left has made lots of changes. They become more independent, they interact more, they've had life that goes on.
Yep.
And the person remembers the life that was, not the life that has been achieved. Reintegration is where the difficulties often accrue.
Right, and and you know, just training for ISS, I heard a lot of stories like that where you're gone half the time training, and then your family moves on, and even things like rearranging stuff in a cupboard or a room or something, and they come back and everything's different, and they're no longer, you know, play the role they used to play. It would cause a lot of stress, and fortunately, I was single during all that time, so I didn't have to go through it. Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Carl has to leave to catch an airplane shortly, but he's really done the yeoman part of the work on this. So we have some charts, if someone could bring them up. There we go. This is Group C, education. If we can go to the next chart, or do I do that here? Okay. Maybe. Here we go. We had 14 participants in our workshop. We represented numerous individual views from several countries and organizations, ranging from government organizations to several nonprofits and academia. I'm going to back up a little bit to 2016. We had some comments about how do we bring forward from year to year our findings and recommendations, and then to measure progress and have achievements that we can report on. So I'm going to go back to 2016. One of our findings in 2016 was that one of our goals is to inspire and educate the public, and that many materials on space activities, some available through web access and so forth, was insufficient in the whole pipeline of education to really not only inspire but to help teachers teach the topic matter. We felt that the international community ought to start pooling its resources. Of course, about this time last year, we were starting to see many of the space agencies, including NASA, pull back funding, and I think it was a 25% decrease in the NASA educational funding. So that was was an actionable item that Carl took forward to the IAF, and there was a discussion there. This is going to be an ongoing dialogue, so I will continue to point back to Carl, because he'll be talking to the committee on exactly what he's doing, because this is going to continue at the International Astronautical Federation. But there was a report to the General Assembly that the space agencies at the heads of agency meeting had agreed to further cooperation on space education and outreach. The Canadian Space Agency's Advisory Committee recommended enhanced support for space education and outreach, and ESA and several other of the space agencies increased an emphasis on space education and outreach. So we're going to use the International Astronautical Federation as well, which meets annually at the IAC, as a mechanism for continuing this action. There is a particular panel at the IAC every year, which is heads of agencies, which is NASA and ESA, and they all sit on a stage together and talk about what they're going to do in the future, and we intend that education be a part of that. So I think we capture some of that on recommendation 1. So we will follow up with this renewed support, establishing a network of networks, we're calling it, for space education and outreach, and use models such as GEOS for that. The space agencies, UNESCO, IF, ISMS, and UNICOPOS would be part of this, and that we're actually creating this framework that's a little more formalized. As a principal product of this network, we'd like to establish between the agencies the development of a web-based space material for educational purposes. One of the models that I actually discussed was something the National Academy of Engineering is doing right now under the sponsorship of the Chevron Corporation, which is a website resource for teachers on all topics, but aerospace is one of them, which is vetted material, projects, content that isn't just Googled on the internet. It actually has teachers behind them. You can talk to teachers that have already presented in the classroom, has a blog content, but allowing us to pool our resources to go forward on this. And so Carl will be following up at the IAF. Now the next Congress will be held in Bremen, Germany next fall. The 2019 Congress will be in Washington, D.C., and so there may be an opportunity, because it's also domestic here, for all U.S. interested parties to become involved in that activity. Finding number 2 shouldn't be unusual, but came out of our committee. I mean, if you've been involved in the educational sector and discussions, this is a pretty obvious outcome. And that if you want to really stimulate interest in young people in aerospace and science and engineering careers, hands-on activities is one of the keys. Finding sponsorships for some of those activities can be a bit problematic, but some of the projects can be those at companies participating in projects, international exchanges, ISU at the graduate level is one, internships, competitions, and hands-on development activities. So our recommendation is to actively work within our communities to find that level of support, whether it be zero-gravity flights, and I know in the United States we have a limited capability to do that now, but in Europe they've got parabolic flights that, if you've looked at the newspapers, they just did one with kids. And they seem to get through that restriction. CubeSats, both at the high school level and now at the university level, is affordable. There's opportunities to the International Space Station. I can tell you from firsthand experience, it's exciting and engaging, and you can get CubeSat kits now and get them in space. And it's not just the process of getting them up there. You can design mini controls centers on the ground with a few computers, and NASA will send the video images directly to the university or the high school. So there's opportunities there. Other ISS experiments. We had I know from the space shuttle point of view, we had a very robust program for gas cans for students as well. We getaway specials, if you hadn't heard that, but they hung on the inside of the payload bay of the shuttle. We had middle school students involved, high school students involved, and that was a very robust program. Recommendation 3, I'm sorry, oops, did I miss finding? Recommendation 2. Well, I'll go to the finding. We found that over the past decade that we'd like to populate this room with more of the pipeline coming forward to pass on this wonderful historical knowledge capture, if you will, and to groom the next generation that will replace us in this room. So we are recommending that for 2018 that we work with ISMS to maybe identify a kind of a pathfinder number of slots, maybe 10, 15, however might be accommodated within the budget, that we would be looking at maybe seniors, graduate level, or postdocs with some leadership background or potential that would be invited to this meeting. And each nation would, or each agency would develop a process for nominating 1 or 2 people to come to it. We haven't decided, we're not going to prescribe that process, but we're going to ask ISMS to consider that. And these would definitely be individuals that would benefit from this networking, from the information that we provide. And we actually discussed having them provide one of the panels. What's the perspective of these young people coming in? You know, we're dealing, I know having come back into academia, we're dealing with a different generation of young people. So how do we keep them engaged in space? How do we groom them to take our place? So we're going to ask George to work with us on how we might do that. In the United States, we talked about actually having them sponsored by the Space Grant organization. I offered through the Texas A&M University to kind of run the competition or the selection. Might not be as mature as what we'll have in 5 years, but at least we'd start identifying individuals that would participate with us. So I'm going to end there, and are there any questions? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, one of my suggestions would be, I think, in recommendation 2, say, finding ways of sponsorships for students. The link to innovation centers or innovation campuses with multidisciplinary capabilities, I think, would be a very good way to integrate the commercial world universities together with this type of activities. So, for example, Howell in the UK.
I see what you're saying.
Yes, Howell in the UK, we're very keen in this type of activity. We're very keen to stimulate more interest in students to uptake these areas, but I think that a more direct link to these activities would be very beneficial.
Okay, so if you'll send an email to Carl or I, then as we create this process, and we do had an ESA person on our panel, so each agency would be responsible for developing that process.
Yeah, and I mean, we can bring the commercial side, so interest from the commercial organizations that could be interested in sponsoring this, and ourselves as well as a campus, we could do that directly as well.
To participate in the scope.
Yes, and we're very
summit.
keen educationally because we're linked to all the research councils in the UK, which obviously have got a big focus on education, so very much up our priority list.
Well, in fact, I know that Rice is continuing to seek sponsors every year for this particular summit, and so maybe you'd like to enlarge that sponsor base to have more international sponsors, not just U.S. sponsors on the meeting.
Yes, I think that would be a very good avenue for this type of things. Thanks.
I think the takeaway that I'd like to leave from this is that we want this committee now to really have actionable findings that we can take forward and report on from year to year. We know we need a multiplier effect, and we think right now the IAF is going to be our multiplier effect. Okay, I think I'm preaching to the choir, and with that, I will step down. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's that time of the summit again. First of all, I'd like to thank those who participated in the group discussions and the reports. In particular, thanks Dan and to Leroy and Carl and Bonnie for presenting the findings and recommendations with actionable items going forward. You know, I'd also like to thank everyone really for participating in ISMS 2017. It's an interesting process in putting this summit together year over year. And there's a lot of input from a lot of individuals. The summit itself really is unique. I can't think of another meeting that's like this. where we're able to talk about important and timely topics in our field. I hope that you found this meeting productive. I think that the panels in particular were very interesting and candid this particular year. And I also hope that you had an opportunity to interact and in some instances reconnect with your colleagues and friends, and in some instances also make new acquaintances and new collaborations with, for example, in my case with our friends from Harwell. Thanks to those of you who traveled to come here, especially our international colleagues, for making the trip. And of course, Mr. Abbey, none of this would be possible without your vision and your energy, and it's a real honor and privilege to work with you and the rest of the committee in putting this meeting together. So safe travels, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Jeff. I would like to echo Jeff's thanks to you all for your participation in this summit. I think it's been a very good summit, and I hope you found it to be very worthwhile. There are probably comments that some of you have that maybe you haven't had an opportunity to make yet. I would welcome your comments on any aspects of the summit, because certainly as we look ahead to 2018, we would like to improve on what we have done so far and make it a more productive conference next year. So I again would welcome any comments or observations that any of you have. A number of you all have talked to me already, but welcome comments from all of you. I regret that we this year, due to the circumstances, we didn't have a number of our invited participants coming from Russia. I would like to try to solve that problem, and Oleg, maybe we can identify the participants, the Russian participants, by January of this year, of 2018, and we can assist you in getting visas so that we would be able to include a number of the individuals that we had hoped to have attend next year. And if there are any other problems any of you foresee, we'd like to start working early to make sure that we get good participation next year. So thank you all for a very interesting 3 days. It's been very worthwhile, and I hope you found Don Pettit's session last night to be interesting. And if you think it's worthwhile, we might even have him come back again next year. So thank you all, and good travel.